Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this lecture series of our competition from the Research Lab. Layer 2.0 is a competition we're dealing with, and I am very excited to launch this. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm very excited to have Regina Stephan with me for our first round of lectures. We just had the starting lecture at the Liebling House just a week ago. And now we're actually launching our Zoom events. And today the topic is modernism. We're talking about modernism and its way of handling from Europe all the way to mandatory Palestine. And I'm very excited to have Professor Dr. Regina Stephan with me. She's an art and architecture historian, born and raised in Stuttgart. 1982 to 1988, she studied art history, modern history, and didactics of the arts at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. In 1992, she had a doctorate with a dissertation studies of Erens Mendesson's department stores and commercial stores in Germany, very relative to our subject today, perhaps, and then postdoctorate at the TU Darmstadt. Since 2008, she's a professor for architecture and urban history at the Mainz University of Applied Sciences. And it's very important for me to share with you that she has been also part of this exhibition, this event, this competition from its beginning. All the thinking process was done together with Regina from the start. And also, I'm very happy that she was a part of our advisory board at the Liebling House with its establishment. So we know each other pretty well, and I'm very much looking forward to hear Regina's lecture. We will, after the lecture, turn over to some modernisms in Tel Aviv Jaffa, and then we'll have time for questions. So Regina, please start.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm also looking forward to this lecture. And I start my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, it works. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm looking forward very much to the competition. I'm really curious to know what is going to happen in this winter semester. And did a presentation on the Mediterranean, Europe's early modernism and its impact on building in mandatory Palestine. And I want to go back quite a lot to the early 19th century with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote in the West.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just can you make a full screen of like a presentation?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
I did this. No, it's better. Yeah, okay, sorry. So Goethe, he said in the West-East Divan published in 1819, those who know themselves and others would also recognize here, Orient and Occident can no longer be separated. With these words, almost exactly 200 years ago, Goethe, the German poet, summed up the special relationship between Occident, Europe, and the Orient. But what was actually meant by the Orient? In Germany, it was generally understood to mean the area of influence of Islam around the Mediterranean, from Constantinople to Jerusalem and Cairo, but also Moorish Spain and its home region in the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. From there came the inspirations for the architecture of Orientalism of the 18th and 19th centuries, which enriched the portfolio of architects in the heyday of historicism, especially since the first quarter of the 19th century. The appropriation of Islamic building forms in the sense of an architecture parlante served to give structural form to the fairy tale Central Orient, which, for example, fired the imagination of Europeans through the much-read fairy tales of the 1001 Nights. The Orient stood for central, physical, even erotic pleasures, opium and hashish, the bath, the harem, and thus for all the pleasures that were hardly accessible in Europe due to strict social conventions and the prevailing sexual morals. Accordingly, orientalizing styles were used for buildings of a cheerful character, like coffee houses, spas, casinos, vaudeville theaters, or summer residences, such as the Royal Pavilion in Brighton or the Wilhelma Palace in Stuttgart. By choosing Oriental forms, a refuge was built for the soul in which it could live out its fantasies. But it was built in the modern techniques like cast iron and stained glass. It was just the decoration with Oriental forms that was chosen when building these palaces. For the architects, Orientalism was by no means easy to realize because very few of them had their own impressions of Oriental architecture. They had to rely on publications. An outstanding example is the chromolithographic work published in 1842, plans, elevations, sections, and details of the Alhambra, from drawings taken on the spot in 1834 by Jules Goury and in 34 to 37 by Owen Jones, a British architect. And you can see just two of those fantastic chromolithographics. There was no traditional canon of styles for the construction of synagogues. When in the second half of the 19th century, after the enactment of the Prussian Jewish law in 1847, numerous synagogues could be built, the congregations often chose the Oriental style. The best known example is the new synagogue on Oranienburger Straße in Berlin, built by Eduard Knoblauch and August Stüler, 1859 to 66. Synagogues of this type had never existed before. They sprang out of imagination. In addition to literary models and artistic inspirations, there was also a brutal side to the relationship between the Orient and the Occident in the 19th century. The colonialism of the great European powers, France and Great Britain. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign in 1798, which ended the Ottoman rule that had lasted since the 16th century and was in turn defeated by Admiral Nelson, marked the beginning of the political and economic influence, if not conquest, of the countries south of the Mediterranean by the Europeans. In particular, the conquest of Algiers in 1830 by France should be mentioned here, which ended only after the Second World War. Profound changes were the result. Cities such as Cairo and Constantinople were modernized according to European patterns and experienced a split into an old Islamic part and a modern European one. This means that at the same time as European Orientalism, European architecture and urban planning were transferred to the Orient. An architectural exchange between Orient and Occident took place. Since the middle of the 19th century, the world's expositions have had a special significance. On the occasion of the First World's Fair in London in 1851, and you see the famous Crystal Palace, so-called fine arts courts were presented, which were also equipped with copies of outstanding Egyptian, Assyrian, Byzantine architecture, sculptures and paintings, but also of the Lions Court of the Alhambra, so from Spain, in Granada. Their task was not least to offer visitors opportunities to educate themselves. And you can see this Alhambra court in the Crystal Palace, which you can see the tissue above, which shows that it is built in a very big hall. The approach of the World's Fair in Paris in 1889 was quite different. It featured a replica of a street in Cairo designed to appeal to all the senses. And you can see it here. This is the Egyptian bazaar, and there's Morocco bazaar. Arab merchants, Oriental music and dance performances and cuisines were meant to give a vivid impression of life in Cairo, which was meant to exemplify the Orient. The street, however, was a mere backdrop architecture. The virtually traveling exhibition visitor went in search of images rather than new knowledge and assembled them into a mental picture composed according to the rules of painting. The Orient was presented as a picturesque yet backward colony in whose history and architecture there was little interest beyond the surface. And I show you the plan of this big exhibition, and you see the Galerie des Machines, which was directly beside the street of Cairo. You see the very strange situation on those world fairs. And this is a look into the Cairo street at the 1889 Paris exhibition. And you see all those Arabs that were brought to Paris to present the Egyptian life. Only 5 years later, a young architect was to take a fundamentally different approach. Joseph Maria Albright had received the Rome Prize of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna in 1893 in recognition of his outstanding academic achievements, which enabled him to spend several months in Italy. It is one of the still unanswered questions of Albright research why he changed his travel plan and made a detour to Tunisia from Sicily. What is certain is that the architecture of North Africa left a deep impression on Albright, and in particular, the simple bodies of houses, the white cubes that line and stagger endlessly, only accentuated by the few blue accents of the doors and window openings. According to Ulrich Maximilian Schumann, Albright was interested in penetrating the essence of architecture, which first and foremost forms space for life itself. Albright drew ecstatically, and I show you just one of the many drawings that he made in a few days, filling several sketchbooks, in which he recorded his impressions of Tunisia and pen and ink drawings, as well as in watercolors. This is a watercolor from Sidi Bou Said in Tunisia. In 1896, only 2 years after his return, Albright had the opportunity to use the knowledge he had gained in Tunisia, but especially in Sidi Bou Said, to design a completely new type of building for a completely new type of artists association. The exhibition building of the Vienna Secession in Vienna, in the form of a white cube. And I show just the first sketch with the with a big cupola. With this building, and I show you the realized drawing. With this building, Albright succeeded in giving a new building task an unmistakable design, in which he did not imitate a style in the sense of historicism, but rather developed a completely new solution on the basis of his travel impressions and his academic architectural training in terms of type, design, and building construction. The contemporary critics reviled the building as Egyptian royal tomb or tomb of the Mahdi. It had borrowings from the Egyptians and Assyrians. The building was thus iconographically charged. In its newness, it became a symbol of overcoming the old, its tombstone, just as the art exhibited in its likewise replaced the old art. It is therefore not surprising that this building became the trigger for Albright's appointment to Darmstadt in 1899 for nothing other than a radical new beginning for architecture. The applied arts, industrial production, and art was to be achieved there. In 1901, Albright gave the studio building that I can show you here, in which the artists were to create anew together the appearance of a flat roof building. The entrance to which is formed by an omega arch, as he had become acquainted with in Tunisia, and with the house of the sculptor Habich, I can show you here in this picture down the hill. He realized the first modern residential building with a flat roof in 1901. It is not least this radical new building in architecture that earned the Mathildenhöhe in Darmstadt the title of UNESCO World Heritage Site this year. It was also the catalyst for numerous architects to travel to Darmstadt to study the buildings on Mathildenhöhe that were absolutely outstanding and very new. Among them was most likely Pierre Jeanneret, who later called himself Le Corbusier. He traveled through Germany several times as a young man and also closely studied in Vienna Albricht's Secession building. However, the most important journey for the young architect was Le Voyage d'Orient, the traveling in the Orient, which he undertook in 1911 together with his friend August Klippstein. His sketchbooks were published as transcribed facsimiles in 2002. It is clear that Le Corbusier carefully studied the structure of Istanbul houses, according to which the first floor was used for storage, while the top floor could be used as a roof terrace. Projecting bay windows provided light for the living spaces on the upper floors. And I show you just two sketches of Le Corbusier's sketchbook of 1911. And on the right-hand side, you may recognize the famous double villa in the Weissenhof settlement in Stuttgart from 1927, where he built according to his ideas that he gained in Istanbul. It is interesting to note that Le Corbusier did not copy this residential building concept, but rather made the different residential structure the starting point for his ideas, which could be implemented with the help of new building techniques. The first basic premise was his plan of the Maison Domino, you see on the left-hand side, of 1914. And then in 1923, the 5 points of a new architecture on the right-hand side. First, the posts or pilotis. Second, the roof garden on a flat roof. Third, the free floor plan design, and thus the elimination of load-bearing wall that allow flexible use of living space. Fourth, the long window cut on the non-load-bearing walls along the facade and provide a very bright light for the apartment with uniform light. And as a 5th point, the free facade design, which is made possible by separating the exterior design from the building construction, the Vorhang facade, the curtain wall. Unlike the architect of the 19th century, whose Orientalisms decoratively reshaped and disguised building construction innovations, the architects of the early 20th century presented new concepts based on their travel impressions, combined with their knowledge of new construction techniques, such as the reinforced concrete skeleton buildings of the White City of Tel Aviv, which were erected after the First World War. They follow the forms of the international style, exemplified by Z.F. Rechter's Englenhaus in 1933, without imitating exactly the building, the architecture of Le Corbusier, as you can see by comparing those two buildings with the decoration of the facade, no shade on the facade of Le Corbusier and a lot of shade on the facade of Z.F. Rechter. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Regina, for this. I think it's a new sort of angle that I learned today, and I would love to discuss it further, also maybe with the students that are here. I'm going to move on to my presentation, which is a little bit more focused on what's happening in Tel Aviv Jaffa, mainly also for people who are abroad, but also for people who are here, perhaps to see Tel Aviv from a different angle. There's always more to see in the White City. So I'll start by just telling the urban legend that, the story here has. I think even architecture in the end of the day is a manifest of some sort of, story, a historical story that we can tell. And for me, it's very important to give this sort of backstage to what happened here with the buildings of the White City. So the urban legends describing the fifth immigration wave as an immigration wave who is mainly coming from Germany in the 30s. 1/3 of this immigration wave are people from either Germany, Austria, or Switzerland. And they always say that they have brought culture with them, sort of not only Goethe and Schiller, but also the coffee shop culture. And here we just see a typical coffee shop that displays this sort of, new culture that appeared in the 30s in the streets of like Ben Yehuda Strasse and so forth. But I'm showing this because the urban legend describes the chug, the circle of architects, the young architects that sat in those coffee shops and said that something radical and dramatic must happen in the urban landscape of Tel Aviv. This new established city cannot look like the places perhaps the third immigration wave came from, like Odessa or Eastern European small towns. It has to be some sort of a utopia, something new, something perhaps a new architectural manifestation for a new sort of man that came out of those harsh conditions of Europe of the Nazi time. So just to show you this kind of mundaneness of the style, I like to show this postcard where it says, Trudi genießt ihre Nachmittagstee auf der schönen Terrasse in unserer Tel Aviv Wohnung, which basically says, Trudi is drinking tea in our porch. But you can also see this sort of in the back that there is still this eclectic style. But this mundaneness of the style is very important, and I'll get in a few seconds to why it was so dramatic and so fast. But this is also a picture of Stuttgart, the same settlement Regina has shown. And here it says 1940 Stuttgart, Weißenhofsiedlung, which actually this postcard was not done in 1940, but it was done in 1936, and it shows Stuttgart in the 40s as sort of an Arab village and as a bazaar. And really what it was a protest against this sort of neue Sachlichkeit of this, very clean and modern style that was built in Germany in the 30s. And across the street, there were already, like, again, this sort of traditional German style red roof pitch top houses. But just to show you that already, the rising sort of right and the Nazis, they didn't like this style. And also the National Socialists closed the Bauhaus school in Dessau and banned everything that had to do with modern art, if it was Expressionism, Dadaism, and Bauhaus was one of the forms of styles this notion of newness was banned for, which is called the generated art, or entartete Kunst, Omenut Menuvenet in Hebrew. And this is, I think, why it was quite easy for those young architects we talked about before to sort of take in this new style, also because it was banned in Germany at that time, but also already because it was very far from the sort of classic architecture that was built here in Palestine before, like the Arab traditional architecture. There were already programs with the local population. So the architecture style they chose needed to address something new. And of course, also the need to build a roof over the heads of so many immigrants led to the formation or the adaptation of the so-called international style. The international style, of course, was not invented in Israel. I don't know if it was invented at all, but the term itself was proclaimed at the MoMA, where there was an exhibition that fetched all the modernists at that time and gave their building style a name and called it international style, sort of like saying architecture can be like Esperanto, a new language for architecture that can be adopted globally anywhere. Sort of after World War I, this notion that we need to bring the society together again. This was something that happened at the Bauhaus, but also at the formation of this kind of international style. Of course, when we look at Tel Aviv today, I don't think there can be an international style because every modernism was adopted to somehow the local climatic and cultural conditions. And of course, in Tel Aviv, this is a very strong feature. You can see here Tel Aviv in the 30s, really over 4,000 buildings of that style. And it is very clear to see their local adaptation to climatic conditions with this long and narrow sort of proportions, a lot of balconies and a lot of sort of adaptation from Le Corbusier strip windows to balconies that sort of filtered the harsh sunlight from penetrating into the living rooms, but rather only brought light in. I really also want to state that we know the architecture here as the Bauhaus architecture. Of course, it is very easy to call it Bauhaus because nobody can understand what international style means. It's not really something that a visitor can relate to. So I don't have a problem with calling this architecture Bauhaus just as a reference. But if we do that, let's understand a little bit how the Bauhaus did influence the local architecture. And I think it's important to talk about Aryeh Sharon, the perhaps most dominant architect that was at the Bauhaus school or studied at the Bauhaus school and influenced our local sort of style. And it's also known that the Bauhaus school had 3 directors, but actually the lesser known one, I have to say, Hannes Meyer, the second one, was actually the most influenced architect on Aryeh Sharon and the local style, because he was a Marxist, a socialist, and Aryeh Sharon, who came from the kibbutz, connected to Hannes Meyer directly. They formed also some worked together, like the ADGB school in Bernau, which was also nominated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But these ideas of socialist architecture can be seen also in Tel Aviv, in, for example, the workers' quarters and other workers' quarters that have been built around Tel Aviv. Basically, this is, though not the dominant style, I have to say, the Tel Aviv's architecture is not a socialist architecture. It is, unfortunately, still like today, or was sort of an investor architecture, because actually people that had money brought their money to mandatory Palestine, created a residential building and rented out the flats. There was even a capitalist certificate back then that the Brits needed in order for immigrants to enter Israel's or mandatory Palestine. So we have to see that those buildings, like also the Living House and the White City Center where we are at, are actually typical residential building owned by wealthy families. But Aryeh Sharon is also important to say in charge of the plan of Israel. No, together with with Ben Gurion, sorry, in 1949, he really made the plan of where cities are going to be spread around in the land of Palestine. He defined where the industry is going to be, where agriculture is going to be, where the water is going to run, of course, with a whole group of other architects, planners, but he was heading this unit. So perhaps Tel Aviv is not a Bauhaus city, but perhaps Israel is a Bauhaus land, if you want to see it like that. Let's look at the architecture in specific. Angle House, which Regina just noted before. Things like the strip windows, which were taken from Le Corbusier, are here set back towards the inner side of the window in order to also let less sun in. Of course, the flat roofs with maybe a space to gather together. The pilotis, which is also an influence by Le Corbusier. The free facade, which Regina showed as well. And the non-symmetry is also very important for the local style and mandatory Palestine back then. The Liebling House is a good example as well. Here, those strip windows got to be strip balconies. And then there is a recession, no? The cube is like split into two, a front cube and a back cube, in order to have as much ventilation as possible circulating around the building. And the thermometer window, which some may say is a translation of this big facade of the Bauhaus Dessau into a narrow one, because of course it's way too hot to have a glass screen at the house. So here we have the only sort of vertical element is the staircase, and a lot of times it's defined by this thermometer window. Here is a glass facade of the Bauhaus Dessau. There is some resemblance to that. Also, those balconies you can see at the students' dormitories of the Bauhaus building as well. This sort of cantilever of the balcony from the top that goes down to the lower balcony, again, in order to filter the sun from coming in indirectly into the flat. Erens Mendesson, I'm sure Regina can talk a lot better about him than me, but I still want to mention him because he's also very influential to what is happening in Tel Aviv. He didn't really build in Tel Aviv. He did do one school where he is signed, but later we discovered that it was somebody who worked in his office. Erens Mendesson was well known for his small sketches that nobody really thought he could realize. But then when he was at the front in the First World War, his wife actually managed to come together with Albert Einstein, and this small sort of sketch became a real building, the Einstein Tower in Potsdam. And it's sort of very plastic movement, this what we call dynamic functionalism, also found its way to mandatory Palestine. This is the Schaubühne he built in Berlin, very curved buildings. And some even say that he met Fritz Lang on the boat to New York, and they also sort of talked about the movie he's going to produce. And it might be that his ideas also influenced the setting of this movie. So when Erens Mendesson came to Tel Aviv, he looked at this building, for example, and said, oh my God, this looks like Le Corbusier eye. It wasn't very positive back then. I think he didn't really like what's happening here, but still we can see that his dynamic functionalism affected the way that Tel Aviv was built back then. Another very important architect I want to mention is Oskar Kaufman, who's very famous in Germany back then. He was perhaps the most well-known theater architect, but he did very lush sort of Renaissance interiors. He did the Volksbühne in Berlin, which is until today a very, very important theater building, and the Habima Square, which brought him to Tel Aviv at the first place. And you can see the resemblance between those two buildings, although one is Renaissance and the other is modernist. Maybe it's the time to also state that in the beginning of the 30s, there was an architect named Yaakov Schiffman Ben Sira, who did not let architects submit plans that were not in a modernistic way of drafting. So the sort of Renaissance or eclectic style was banned from his table, which led to the principle that every architect built in this sort of modernist style, and most of the architects were very, very young, under 30 even. This is an example for maybe an older sort of generation architect who was very established when he came here already. And he built only one more building in Tel Aviv, which is the Dvorak House, which is now being renovated. It's a residential building, but if you look closely, it really looks like a theater as well, with this kind of lodges and balconies. And in the front, there is like 2 staircases leading up to the entrance. So it's very theatrical as well. And the last one I want to mention is Ev Hala, also an older sort of most practiced already architect that was mainly in Leipzig. This is a Jewish cemetery hall, which is unfortunately destroyed, but you can see really this sort of lush ornamentation that is here. And later on, he built in Tel Aviv in this modernistic style, and we call it maybe, I don't know, wedding cake sometimes, because it looks like it has a lot of white waves. But this is actually also a very important architect that built here back then. Yes, and of course, one must mention that women took a strong part in the design of Tel Aviv from the start, which was not common in Europe at all at that time. And here we see, of course, Jania Avelbuch's Dizengoff Square. And some say this was a competition that was done in Berlin, and this winning entry, which was never built, kind of resembles the Dizengoff Square. Still, I think it's very important to state that. Another fact that we found out at the Liebling House, which I think plays a role if we talk about storytelling, is that we found at the Liebling House that a tile fell down. And at the tile, there was a writing saying Valerie and Boch, Mettlach, Germany. And we researched it, and we found out that actually a lot of products in the Liebling House, but also in other buildings in Tel Aviv, are originally from Germany. And then when we researched it further, we found out there was an agreement between the Zionist movement and the Nazis, which allowed products to come to mandatory Palestine. So back then, Jewish money could not be taken out of Germany on one hand, and on the other hand, there was a boycott already from the American on German goods. And Arlozorov, the leader of the Zionist movement, saw this as an opportunity and convinced the Nazi regime to sort of make an agreement where Jewish people would bring their money into a bank, Treuhand, which then would buy products. And these products were then shipped to mandatory Palestine together with the immigrants. And this led to some sort of a very drastic, dramatic movement from Germany to mandatory Palestine, with a lot of modern products, which some of them can be seen here. It's from metal to sinks and a lot of other things that not even only have to do with the architecture, but this is also sort of a great impact on what happened here physically at the land of Palestine. And also here you can really see at the newspaper that was published back then how to bring your money in form of goods to mandatory Palestine. Okay, so for the closing of my lecture as well, I would like to just remind us that Tel Aviv was declared as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003. One of the reasons is the synthesis of outstanding significance of various trends of modern movement. So it's not one Bauhaus, it's a lot of modernisms and their adaptation to local and climatic conditions. And the second criteria, which is not referred to the buildings itself, is the town planning, which Ruti, which is here, Ruth Shalev, which is here with us as well, is going to talk about more in the lecture. that she's going to give, I think, in 2 weeks. But it is very important to stay that the buildings here are not out of context, and I urge you to look at the buildings with their surroundings as well. And as the Scottish anthropologist Sir Patrick Geddes, which was brought here by the British Mandate, stated, the city is first and foremost a product of human society and must be treated as a colony of organisms. The topographical, climatic, vegetation, and welfare conditions of all population groups, including children, adults, and the elderly, marchants, managers, and workers. So this is it from my side. And now I really want to open this discussion up for, yep. Oops. For discussion. I'm sorry, I just disappeared. So if there are any students with us who would like to ask us something, either Regina or me, please raise your hand or just open up your microphone. I guess not. So yeah, Regina. Do you maybe want to add something on Erens Mendesson, which we just showed here, because you really are sort of the expert on the field? I can't hear you, you're on mute.
As you already said, he was not amused when he came to Tel Aviv in 1934. He was there in Mandatory Palestine in 1923, and he was very impressed by the original architecture from the Palestinians. So Jaffa, that we have got very nice letters and also postcards to his daughter, which was a young girl then. And he was very impressed about the really Arab society and the architecture of the villages and the old cities, especially Jerusalem was his most beloved city, I think, all of his life. And when he came back after 11 years, he was pretty shocked about the architecture that has had so many imitations of his own work, as you showed, the curved windows and all of that, and the balconies. It worked like a catchy song. So like a catchy song or catchy tune. It was no longer something that was part of his design. That was because he made his design especially for this site, for the special site. And what was done in Tel Aviv then was to just put some balconies, some with rounded corners on buildings without that specific contact to the site. And this was quite shocking for him. So he changed his architecture in Palestine, in Mandatory Palestine, and he wanted to have more adaptation to the climate and to the material. And therefore he when he came to Palestine to live and work there, he did not come to Tel Aviv, but he chose Jerusalem, an Arab windmill, to get into contact with the old, very old country. And all of his buildings look very different to what he did in Germany and also in Britain in the 20s and in early 30s. So there was a big, for him, it was a big problem that so many imitations were done and were possible. So this is also why he didn't build in Tel Aviv. He did not appreciate really this city.
Yeah, so I think some might call him a regionalist, no? Like somebody who wants to sort of really connect the sort of architecture to the landscape, like you mentioned. And I think it's maybe also interesting if we talk about your lecture for a second, that really Le Corbusier was influenced by the Levant sort of in order to create modernism, which is almost like, you know, a closed circle, because we always think that it is kind of an international style, where actually it's kind of taken from our region in the end of the day. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at it like that.
This is why I had to go back so many years, because I think that it is so important to see this you know, exchange of ideas and forms. And we sometimes see it only from the European perspective, and I think it's pretty wrong. And what I really like with the idea of modern architecture is that they realize the chances of modern construction techniques and the historic way of building in the Levante or in Istanbul or wherever, in order to make something new that is adapted to modern living ideas and wishes and modern techniques, and also to the climate. So it's a very interesting combination of both.
So if you look at the architecture that was planned here, can you compare it in any way to what you analyze in Germany? Or is it really too far away? Is it a whole different style, or is it just like an accent of the style?
You mean the architecture of Tel Aviv? I think it's interesting because they, as I showed the two photographs of the Engel House and the double villa in Stuttgart of Le Corbusier, and the ideas are pretty much the same, but the details are very different. And this is what I like, because the building in Stuttgart doesn't have any shadow on the facade. The windows are right flat, absolute in the front of the facade. So there is no chance for any shadow. And this is what was changed in Tel Aviv. And I think this is so important, because you need to adapt to the climate. And you also presented in your lecture several buildings and photographs where you show that the balconies are so important for shadowing the living spaces. So you've always got the balconies, and you've got the, I don't know how you call it, die Schützen.
Aprons.
The wall is hanging down, so that the free space where the sun and the wind can enter at the balconies is limited. So everything is done to produce shadow. And this is something that is absolutely new and not used in Germany, where you seek the sun, usually.
Yeah, it's like
maybe now with climate change, this might change, but at that time, you would always have wide window openings towards the south. And it's very interesting to compare, for example, the buildings that Mendelssohn built at exactly the same time, because he had two offices, one in London and one in Jerusalem in the 1930s. And he built in Great Britain, and he built in mandatory Palestine, and built private houses. And they look so very different, with all the big windows in the UK, and all the pergolas and small windows, and shadow building elements in Palestine. So this is quite interesting that they did an adaptation to the climate and to the totally different region. And I'm with you. I think that he is a kind of regionalist, because he always adapts to the place where he builds, without imitating the historic style, by the way.
Yes, which it's also very interesting if you look at the Lieblinghaus where we are sitting, because we really did a study, and Irita Mir from ESD is also going to give a lecture next week, but we actually studied the climatic conditions at the building itself, and we were so amazed to discover how Dov Karmi really understood the way the sun is projected on the building, and where the circulation flows, and how to adjust the building to the sun. And it was measured that the temperature in the summer inside the house is so much lower than the outside if you use it right, which is quite amazing because really in Tel Aviv we built so much today, and I don't think there is any more real thought about, you know, those climatic conditions like back then, because everybody wants to have like screen walls, like you can see it here, but you know, you cannot be there for 5 minutes without an air condition. And when we build building additions, I think it's one of the things that we should look into. No, not only like reading, sort of really understanding the building that we're building on, but also taking into consideration the climatic conditions of the site. And as I stated before, at the sort of HUL approach, not only looking at the building, but really at its surroundings, as well as at the building itself. So it just reminds me of our topic, the building extension. And Regina, if you want to add something before we finish the session on the competition itself, or what is important for you, please do.
Well, thank you. I think it's really extremely important that we learn from the past. I was impressed when we were talking about the Liebling House and all our meetings during the restoration, that there was this natural ventilation system, so that you don't need really air conditioning, but you can do it by using the natural ventilation. And I think it's so important not to always think about electric solutions, but by using the power of nature. So taking care of the green, taking care of shadowing measurements like pergolas, like different means to bring shadow to the windows, to have windows, but not in the bright sun. I think this is so important. So learning from the past, looking on how they did it in the 1930s when air conditioning was not possible in the same extent than today, is something I think is really very important. And to use also building materials that are not, it must not be concrete, because we know that concrete is so bad for CO2. So we should try to use other materials in order to not impact more CO2 into the atmosphere. So for me, it is really important to take care for the needs of the people that will live in there, but not by using only machines, but by using natural ventilation and shadow measurements and green. So having green flat roofs is something also very important for the climate. And this is why I also showed all that historic background, because I think that Le Corbusier really took a lot of inspirations from the buildings of Istanbul.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So thank you everybody for participating, and thank you, Regina, for this very interesting lecture. Next week we will have Nirit Amir from ESD, who will talk to us about greening methodologies in buildings, and also Lila Harel, professor at Bezalel, who's also an expert on conservation and retrofitting. So it's going to be an exciting lecture next week as well, and please join us again. This lecture is going to be on our website, of the competition website soon, so if you want to see it again, please go ahead. And I hope you all have a nice evening. You too, Regina. And we'll see you soon. So, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.